Welcome to another episode of Tell Me More. We have a great conversation, kind of recapping faith at home, but also diving deep into the world of inaugurated eschatology. And we hope it is a really helpful listen for you as you try to figure out what all of this means for you as you live your daily life.
Okay, welcome to this episode of Tell Me More. There's a lot to talk about, a lot to celebrate, a lot to get on the same page about. Surprisingly, to most people, just 8 days ago was Easter Sunday.
Oh, no.
And we have lived a tremendous amount of life between now and then. And there's there's much to talk about. I want to celebrate Easter. You want to start there? Let's go chronologically. I want to celebrate Easter.
What a great...
I want to celebrate Easter every day in my heart.
What a great day.
But Easter at First Baptist Arlington last Sunday.
It was so good.
It was really good. It was really special. And I know I guess we've had a podcast since then.
We have.
But I just,
we just keep on living that resurrected life.
There it is.
Let's do
and
it.
we, as a church, really as a culture, we're really good at anticipating things, but not as good at like keeping them going. So I just want to say, what a great...
We are Easter people.
Easter people. And just yesterday was the first Sunday since Easter, which it just felt like we had done so much. Golf tournaments, Faith at Home weekend, just life here, funerals, all of it. You know, we just packed it in. So can we talk about Faith at Home?
Let's do it. It was so
Where do you want to
good.
go? Yeah.
I don't even know what to say beyond it was so good.
Well, okay, a lot of our listeners don't have kids at home, so they wouldn't have gone to Faith at Home. So, Luke, can you give them just a little synopsis of what we did or what the purpose of, whatever?
I'll give a shout out to the Young Families team. That's Ryan, Chandler, Casey Fagan, David Butts, Susanna Tate, Angela Hicks, Tiffany Ward, and Brad Eccles, who oversees them. Did such a good job putting on a great event, just starting
Through
and through, great event.
Good communication. Easy, as a young parent, young kid. I'm not
well
that young.
done.
My kids are young. We could,
So well done as an event, but
if you had 2.5-year-olds, it was well thought out and well done all around.
Yeah.
So
Really good.
but the speaker was amazing.
So good.
Justin Whitmill Early.
He's written 3 books. One of them is specifically about parenting. So if you're not a parent, I'd actually still encourage you to check it out. Maybe you're grandparenting.
Yeah, that's the
really good.
Habits of the Household.
That's Habits of the Household.
That was the most pointed to parents of the weekend.
But he has one just about your own discipleship. It's called The Common Rule. So setting up kind of your own habits. So his kind of first night was he's talking to parents. So you can't disciple your children if you're not a disciple yourself. So great point. And then talked about just kind of these habits around parenting. Introduced a new kind of movement that churches are taking on called the Hang 10 movement, which as a parent who's starting to think about how we integrate technology was a really encouraging thing. The basic idea is no social media and no smartphones till 10th grade. And that's...
But that your community would adopt that.
your community is
people.
adopting that. So I know...
So you're not just the weirdies
Yeah.
that when your kids don't have phones, but they're all coming home and being like, but all my friends have TikTok,
But this movement rooted in, I think, spiritual wisdom, but also really good psychological research that we now have on the
it's a good blend, isn't it? Yeah.
Technology on teenagers and their development. So I know our families team is talking about that, which I'm really encouraged by.
Yeah, I think it's really fun. I mean, not that we could implement it all as of Saturday at Faith at Home, but I was talking to Ryan Chandler about it. Like, wouldn't it be cool if our church families basically said, like, hey, if you're a First Baptist family, here's what we're adopting in terms of our relationship as a family with technology for our kids' sake, and we're all going to do this together. That way it's not weird when your kids, let's say weird. You could be weird. We're going to be weird because we're Christ followers.
But you're not the only weird ones.
Yeah, and you're doing it together. And that is community, right? Christian community particularly. Yeah, it's a little bit out there, but we're going to be out there together.
So
for the sake of the gospel.
He had so
the
many
health of
good
our
things to
children.
say.
Yes. It just really was good.
What stood out to you? I'm a little further along this parenting journey than you are.
Oh, Casey asked me which talk was my favorite, and I was like, I don't even know the difference between the 3. I mean, not that I was, now she said, he kind of went through each book and each talk. I'm like, oh, that makes sense. But, Ryan and I had really good conversations on the way home, and then we actually had a date night Saturday night, which is rare. But we had a chance to be together without the kids and to just talk through some of like who we want to be and what we're developing and, kind of like pats on the back. Some things we are naturally doing well just because that's our own proclivity, and some things we're not doing well. Talked about family systems, like the way you talk about this in premarital counseling, and then it gets real when you have kids, I think, in our experience. What did you bring from your family of origin, and how do you want to apply that? What did you bring and you really want to let go of or do better? And so just some good, I think what I liked about it is incredibly practical.
So practical.
And I like that my husband sat next to me, listened, and then we talked about it when we got home. Like that's the mark of probably a pretty helpful retreat, or whatever we want to call it, conference weekend that we hopefully will implement. Particularly for us at home, I know that's the first question you asked and I rambled about it, but
tell me more.
Our own faith rhythms, particularly in the morning, because we're not morning people. So we wake up to like kids screaming. So like there's no holy, it is very, very holy, but what you would like stereotypically picture of like, I'm going to wake up, get ready, brew a cup of coffee, go back into my prayer closet.
Quiet time, and I'm using air quotes here.
Yeah, it's not.
It's hard with toddlers.
Yeah. So like, what does that look like for us? And how do you do what you need to do in terms of like getting settled for the day in who you are as a beloved child of God without a 30-minute lined up? Because that's not real for us. Now we could do that in the evening. We could carve out time for that. Like there's places for that, but we're just historically, I married someone who is maybe worse than me in terms of not being a morning person, which is what it is. But so that, and then just some of our rhythms of like, we're starting to eat dinner together because we just feed them like kid food and then they go to bed and then we eat. But like we're starting to, so like how do we make the most out of the table, which we find to be very, very important, but to make it intentional. So just putting some intention between, and
I love it.
And then the long-term like technology conversations, but we're not there yet. We're not giving our kids phones now.
We are not either.
But So anyway, that's a long and rambling. But that's a synopsis though of what we talked about. It's like you're very practical. Like technology is ruling our lives unless we get a hold on it. So how do we get a hold on it?
So as I heard several amens coming from the Wiles pew at various points. So as both a pastor of this church and as a poppy, what are some of the things that stood out to you?
Well, I would say, first of all, I appreciated his vulnerability. He shared a lot of, just demonstrated a lot of transparency in the way he communicated. But, we're very big table people. So Cindy is a stickler for, if the kids are with us, the grandkids, when our kids are a little bit now, the grandkids, devices are turned off. There's no. Now, if it's an Auburn game and we happen to be grilling out and eating a dinner, watching an Auburn football game, the football game.
There's something different about socially watching a game together.
Correct. But in general, though, like Cindy cooks every Sunday, and pretty much mostly everybody comes to our house to eat on Sundays. She's been.
When you say everybody, how many chairs is that? How many seats at the table?
It depends, but it could be as many as Hannah and her crowd. So that's 5, Josiah and Adrian and Gideon. So that's 3, and us. So, and then, we have occasionally single adults in our church who don't necessarily have family here. And just through the years, different ones of them have found their way to our table. Cindy used to have the rule that you had to be at church on Sunday morning to have the meal. We don't always do that, but
once again, real life. We're living real life.
But she's a stickler for being at the table, having a meal, sharing about your life, and so we have all kinds of traditions built around the table. So there was a lot of affirmation from us because he talked a lot about that, and just his commitment to being intentional in a way that is realistic. But you've got to be disciplined to make it realistic, or it's just not going to happen.
Right.
So I liked that about it. I think he gave manageable, reasonable advice about things that can make a real difference. Because I think over time it makes a difference. Like we'd been doing this for years, and we had one young adult who just one day was at our home and pretty much came a whole lot to our Sunday gathering. And just one day we were just sitting there talking, and he just said, this is the only time I've ever had a family meal as an adult. And he said, our family did do this growing up. He said, I don't ever remember sitting at a table. He said, the only memories I have of sitting at a table and eating lunch and having conversation is at y'all's home. And,
wow.
And so with the little guys, Cindy will ask them, what's your rose? What's your thorn? What's your sunflower? Like if it's in the evening, what's today has happened that's been a really good thing? What's been a challenging thing? What's been kind of a fun thing? And then on birthdays, we have a special time where everybody goes around the table and says one or two things about the person that's their birthday, what's special about them, and why you not why you love them, because we love them no matter what, but what it is about them that you just appreciate at this particular moment in their lives. And we've had some very interesting, emotional, times. So when anything has a special time, like with Adrian and her family, her parents usually come as well. Like at Easter, her parents, her granddad, and sister, they all come. So it's our family and Adrian's family, Josiah's wife. And we do that very thing. We go around and talk. And one year, our two grandsons, one of them got to talking about the other one, and they both started crying, which was very,
tender,
obviously, they weren't planning on it, of course. These are teenage boys. And
They generally don't plan to cry.
exactly.
No, they probably hate it when they
really
do.
embarrass them if they heard this, but I'm pretty sure they're not listening to this podcast. So, but yeah, we just got and we still have those memories. So sometimes when we're doing this, one of them will say, "All right, no crying today. Okay, we're just going to say what we want to say."
Straight up about it. I love it.
So that whole idea of rhythm and the small habits that don't seem like they're that big a deal, they really do shape your life. So that's what I was really
That was a great
affirming.
takeaway from the weekend. You
It
know,
is.
like you don't have to be a monk
Yeah.
and adopt a just radically different lifestyle than what you're
Right.
doing, but you can incorporate some really thoughtful moments that shape your family.
Yeah. And I think it's a line in his book. I don't know that he said it from the stage, but one of his lines about spiritual habits is something is always better than nothing. And so
That would be a sentiment that he didn't say it that way, but I totally
He kind
agree.
of exuded that. It was just really good. I enjoyed it. And I was grateful that we had it. Grateful for all those my goodness, over 100 children. So I looked around that room that night that we had the worship. It was a little overwhelming. And the little beady guys weren't even in there.
No, we didn't bring our kids.
Adler
when he
wasn't
says
even in there.
overwhelming, if you weren't there, there was a full-on, we'll call it a praise dance section.
I was going to call it a mosh pit.
Liturgical,
So somewhere
liturgical
between those two
movement, I
things.
guess is what it was.
But it's
just
sweet.
seeing the freedom of those
Yeah.
children worshiping with their families and having fun in their church, and and
that
just
setting,
very electric. It was really good, really sweet, and memorable.
Vivacious.
Yeah, it was fun.
And then we didn't. We had to go home when it was over because it was over at like 8. I mean, we needed 8:15, I think. And so for us, that's like, we got to go home, get them in bed. But I heard that people stayed for a long time, and
did.
that organic time together.
They did.
Just from a church perspective, is so healthy and good. I'm so glad
Yep.
to have kids and their families just want to hang out and talk and
It
be
was very
together
good,
and run
sweet,
around together.
Healthy. That's what I'd say.
So good.
Yeah, so
So good.
it was great. So I don't actually know if our Young Families team listens to this either, but if they do,
Good job, Young
well
Families
done.
team.
We're proud of y'all, and
It's
it's
awesome.
a great
And all the
effort.
volunteers, like
So
60
many
volunteers.
And great
Thank you.
people. And it's not just anybody. Those are great people.
Yeah.
They are.
Playing with our kids, loving our
Serving
kids,
food.
all of it.
Yeah.
I'm very grateful.
Yeah.
Our church
First
has,
Baptist at its best.
I know.
It was.
It's
So
good. Okay.
this is a podcast brought to you by
First Baptist Arlington.
and we would be remiss if we didn't mention that this midweek there's a family fellowship, so no masterpiece electives,
Yes. No forum.
no forum,
No grief, share, divorce care. We're done.
no grief share divorce care. But if you've got kids in the fellowship hall, youth are continuing on as normal. So if you have teenagers, students, they're gonna keep on doing their thing. But if you've got grade school, preschool kids, fellowship hall, young family fellowship.
We love it.
Yep.
So
And then we're done for a little bit
yep,
with Wednesday nights. Those
Camp.
obviously choir rehearsal.
camp kicks
Summer
up,
activities.
summer programming
Yeah,
starts.
We kind of re-gear for
So
a
much
totally
happening.
different landscape.
So much.
The only thing that'll keep going is Pastor's Wednesday Bible study for another 4 weeks.
and youth.
Right.
Yes, thank you.
And the youth,
Thank you.
right.
There is youth. Youth keeps up with the school year because they know they have to.
Yeah, keep the kids going.
Not that they don't want to, but you can't
it's
tell
good for
them we
If
won't
you
see
don't
you
do
for
youth
3
group,
weeks.
they'll just go to another youth group.
Yeah, and get disconnected, and they know
right.
better. So, way to go, Chelsea and Tanner.
Yes. Okay.
There's a lot to talk about that is not in the past, but is in the present, as
Yeah,
in what
this-
you preached yesterday.
Yeah.
There's a ton to talk about.
And we quote, this is going to be a little bit heady.
Yes, that's what you said in the first service. This is going to be a little heady, and
Potentially.
you promised, you wrote a check, and you cashed it. you delivered.
Potentially.
Because I thought it was a bit heady, but I think that's part of the DNA of our church is that we're not just going to spoon feed you the basics.
That's right.
You're going to explore
You're
the
gonna
depths
learn.
of God, which is in that. It's a promise you made at the beginning of the year, and it's in that actual text you read. So, no apology needed.
Right.
We want our people to be deep people. But this was one of those. So where do we want to start? I've got some
There's
thoughts.
so many places we could start.
Yeah.
Why don't you kick us off?
I've got a big question. I mean, let's just get into it. Can I ask, we've talked a lot about inaugurated eschatology, which is a big word, but you've said it enough, we've said it enough that maybe our people are starting to kind of catch on to what inaugurated eschatology is. So can you help me with what inaugurated eschatology is not? So we believe in the already but not yet. Inaugurated eschatology is kind of what we're living in. But obviously that's one thought on paradigm of experiencing life right now. What is the what's out there that's, if I don't believe in that, I believe in fill in the blank. Can you help us navigate that? That might help me know what it is if we talk about what it's not.
Well, probably the easiest thing to do would be to get rid of the already.
Just that we're living in the not yet.
Yeah. So if you want eschatology to only be about
the future.
Then just get rid of the already. And the problem I have with that, we'll have a lot of problems with that. But one of them is, in Acts 2, when Simon Peter is trying to figure out, the disciples, not just him, he happens to be their spokesman, they're trying to figure out, well, what is going on here? All of a sudden they're speaking in languages they've never been
they've
trained
been clothed
in.
with power from on high.
Exactly. And it had to be a monumental moment because they all knew they couldn't speak all these languages, and all these people are listening to them and responding, and they're having conversations, and the Spirit is falling upon them. And then Simon Peter says, I know what this is. This is the prophecy of Joel. And he quotes it, in the last days, that's how he starts it, in the eschaton, I'm going to pour out my Spirit. And so just reading that tells me, well, then the last days have already begun.
Yeah, they saw themselves as the fulfillment of last day prophecy.
They're
in the Old
already
Testament.
happening.
Exactly.
It's happening.
And not everything was fulfilled in that prophecy.
No.
That wasn't the point, but there was enough there to give credibility to the fact that this has begun. But if your eschatology, which just means last, another word for time in Greek, just the last, eschaton's the last time, if you will.
So your eschatology would be like your theology
Your view
of
of the
the
end
last
of
times.
time.
Yeah. Which
And there's
we got 'em.
personal and cosmic. So there's eschatology about what happens to you as a person when you die.
Exactly.
Which you also got into. And there's eschatology about what happens to everything.
Big picture.
Yeah.
Right.
And these are questions that are very relevant. I mean, people,
They are.
in our care
For
world,
many people, yeah.
in our care world, we
Oh,
get
yeah.
kind of waves of people. This is very, very poignant for you in this moment. You really want to know what's happening to my loved one.
That's right.
Yeah.
Of course.
What
I
might
think
happen
it
to me when things, get a diagnosis? You're
Right.
starting to think about
Exactly.
what does happen after this, And so we want to give due to all that.
And I think when we think about eschatology, it is the last things. Typically, if you were to go pick up a systematic theology, it's at the end. I think the exception is it is the last
Because
thing.
it's the end of
The
days.
exception, I think,
Yeah.
is the Baptist theologian Stanley Grenz. I think in his systematic theology put it first
Because it orients all things.
because
is that the
he
idea?
says ultimately everything that is determined by what it is becoming.
Right.
And so he puts eschatology at the
I like.
beginning, which is a very different move.
Which is cool. I mean, because it's the lens through which you interpret all things,
Yeah.
right? So if there's a camp that says like, well, we scratch out the already, and we're really just focused on the not yet. This isn't the world sucks. Pardon my French. I'm quoting.
Going
I'm
to
quoting
hell in a
other people.
handbasket.
I'm quoting other people. The world sucks, but one day we'll get saved from it.
That's right.
So let's just keep our eyes fixed on that.
If there was a song, it's "I'll Fly Away."
And is there right? And is there a camp that might scratch through the not yet and just focus on basically God here and now
Sure.
and nothing? You know what I mean?
Well, not necessarily nothing, not if you're a Christian, but typically when you have a conversation about eschatology, somehow or another, the word millennium gets placed in the middle of the conversation. And that's all based upon what you believe is going to happen with that 1,000-year reign of Christ that's mentioned in the
I was a
book of
kid in the
Revelation.
90s. My grandma bought me Left Behind Kid Edition.
I read those.
Scared the mess out of me.
Yeah, good.
It really did.
Good.
It scared me
I hope
big.
it had the right effect on you.
Well, I don't know. Here I am. But in fact, when I was at Truett, I took a children's ministry class, really just to get credits to graduate because I was toward the end. But it was actually super helpful. But this guest teacher made us draw out scenes from our childhood that were spiritually formative. It's actually a pretty cool practice.
Yeah.
I would recommend y'all doing it. One of them was my grandma giving me the Left Behind kids books.
Tim LaHaye.
Because it scared me. And then another one was my very fundamentalist neighbor inviting me to Heaven's Gates, Hell's Fury. Is that what that's called?
Was it a Hell House?
basically, but in like a play form.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then they wanted me to go backstage and pray the prayer with somebody when it was over, which I did because they made me and no idea what that meant. Anyway,
Very effective means of evangelism.
That's why we do them
the
all the
last
time.
frame I drew, which has nothing to do with this conversation at all, but since we're on it, the last frame I drew was my parents tucking me in at night. Because
let's hope that's the best one.
Ooh.
because your first
Some faith at home.
Because I learned somewhere along the way that your first image of God is your image of your parents.
Yeah,
and so for those who have ears to hear, let's get this right. Yeah. But my parents were not particularly spiritual. We kind of grew in faith together.
Yeah.
They're wonderful parents and wonderful Christians now, I'd say. But they just showed me a lot of love at the tuck-in time. So it was more about like playing with my stuffed animals. But anyway, a feeling of security and love at a very young age.
Yeah.
Tie all that together. Anyway, Tim LaHaye scared the mess out of me and formed a culture in the U.S. Based on something to do with the millennium.
We could make a whole
right?
podcast about Tim LaHaye.
But the millennium.
It was already here, though, before Tim LaHaye.
Late Great Planet Earth.
Yeah,
yes, but that's where I encountered it, I would say.
Right.
So,
But this whole idea about what, if the millennial reign of 1,000-year reign of Christ.
Okay, wait, can I pause? Because last week we did Theories of Atonement.
Yeah.
are we doing theories of millennium now?
Theories of the Millennium now.
This
New
segment.
So
Well, yeah.
Wow.
we have, and strangely, maybe we've actually been getting, I'm the person who gets all of the emails through the website.
Yeah, what's
We've
in
been-
the air right now?
We've been getting a lot of questions about the millennium and what our church believes, which is, I don't know that we have like a whole official church-wide
No, we don't.
stance on the millennium.
No,
but there are
But our pastor can have some personal theology on it.
three general views. And they have subsets, but there's pre-millennium, there's post-millennium, and there's amillennium,
And then there's D-Dub's category, which is historic premillennial, right?
Correct.
Yeah,
which is a subset of premillennium.
right. I'm sorry, but if it's his, it gets its own category.
Exactly. But it's really built around the idea of what do you believe about the return of Jesus and when will Jesus return, which is usually the eschatological question that most people are interested in, obviously. And so the focus is on the end. And that's probably my critique of all that would be that I believe that the reason that I'm convinced integrated eschatology to me is important is because it allows us to have the focus across the entire continuum. The focus is right now, the kingdom of God is here on this earth already. Why would Jesus ask us to pray for God's will to be done on earth like it is in heaven if that wasn't a possibility?
Yeah.
And so, but the whole idea of the reign of Jesus in Revelation 20, what do you do with that? And when is Christ going to return? Is he going to return before then?
Before the millennium, which would be premillennium.
Which would be a premillennialist. Or if he's going to return afterwards, a postmillennialist. If you don't believe the millennium is actually a literal 1,000-year reign of Jesus, that Latin prefix negates what follows it. So there's not a millennium, if you will. And so there's just so much written about all of that. And in the American Protestant context, you had a heavy influx in the early 1900s of this view that God works differently in various periods of time.
And this starts with the Schofield Reference Bible, if I remember correctly. So if you have one of those, that's kind of the origin.
He's one of the guys promoted. There's a guy named Clarence Larkin that wrote a book called Dispensational Truths. I have it in my library. It's a big, huge book. He was a draftsman.
If you're just listening and not watching, you have made a really big book with your hands.
It's a huge book.
I mean,
and it's full of drawings
about the millennium. Drawings
about
of
the dispensations of time that God works in various dispensations.
Sorry, when you said drawings, I perked up.
And for those who have listened to every episode, you may remember when we talked about cessationism, which is the view that the gifts of the Spirit cease.
Correct.
Cessationism is inherently tied to dispensationalism.
Correct.
Because there are
because
eras.
God works differently
in different eras. And we are in an era where the works of the Spirit have ceased.
Correct.
In this dispensation.
These miraculous, certain of the sign gifts, if you will,
Yes.
no longer exist. But this, plus also at the heart of the dispensational perspective is that Israel is the actual chosen people of God. And so all of history is aimed toward the restoration of Israel. And so we're in what's known as the great parenthesis of time. The church lives in the church age, which is the parenthesis. The church will be raptured out. then God will once again redeem and restore Israel. And then once that takes place, and they truly live fully into being the people of God in its fullest measure, then Christ will ultimately return and set up his reign in Jerusalem, for 1,000 years. But he's going to return prior to that. There's the postmillennial view, which was very popular at the late 1800s, early 1900s, was this idea that humanity, because of the work of God and the work of the Spirit, was on a generally upward trajectory.
Yeah.
So that we were going to experience the reign of Christ, if you will, and then Christ would return.
And this is really tied to, if you know your philosophers, Hegel is a German philosopher who kind of believed that history is on this upward spiral
Correct.
of progress, and it's just marching towards its zenith. And really what ends it is World War I, World War II, the atomic bomb, the Holocaust. And it becomes really hard to believe that humanity is on any sort of upward spiral after those events.
Right. Yeah. The 20th century dealt a big blow to postmillennialism.
You'll find very few postmillennials
There's not many
anymore.
left. But what's fascinating about the Baptist family, we've had three very prominent Baptist preachers in the 20th century in the Baptist context, Southern Baptist context, I guess to say more correctly. W.A. Criswell, George Truett, Herschel Hobbs. Those three men. It would be hard to exaggerate the influence of those three men over the 20th century Baptist life. Truett and Criswell were both pastors of First Baptist Dallas in succession. Hobbs was the pastor of First Baptist Oklahoma City, but Hobbs wrote all of the Sunday school material for Southern Baptists for probably 30 years.
In the book we give deacons.
That's right.
I mean, for the deacons listening, that's the same Herschel Hobbs.
And what's interesting is many people view Dr. Truett as the greatest preacher in Southern Baptist history, and he was a post-millennialist. Many people view Dr. Criswell as maybe one of the greatest pastors in Southern Baptist life, and he was a dispensational premillennialist. And many people view Herschel Hobbs as the greatest scholar pastor that we've ever produced, and he was an amillennialist. So you've got three of the most prominent
And what we want you to
Baptist
hear in this is all of these are orthodox.
Exactly. They're just very different. But the focus is on the end with every one of them. The focus is on what is going to happen at the end. Whereas my take, and so that's the not yet. It's all, to me, those views are all about the not yet. Whereas for me, now George Eldon Ladd was a teacher at Fuller Seminary. He taught what was called realized eschatology. So he was a little heavier on the now and the already, if you will. So I think
the word realized is
so
in it,
he's
right?
pushed
Sure.
a little bit
Yeah.
further to the other direction for me. Somewhere in between those two would be inaugurated eschatology, which is where I would be, where there's enough focus on what's happening right now that we're already living in this kingdom. We're already being prepared by the Lord for eternity while we're on this earth. We don't wait until we die for that. That's happening right now. And his kingdom is already being expressed on this earth right now to fully be consummated one day in the future. So yeah, I'm a huge believer in it, and I believe that if you want to, my critique of dispensationalism is that it's way. First of all, I believe it has if I can say this respectfully, it has a premise that I just disagree with. That fundamentally, I believe that God has related to us in these two massive covenantal eras, and that the children of Israel were in that first covenant. They were the people of God without question. But now the chosen people of God are in the new covenant era, and that new covenant era was initiated by Jesus. And so that's one way to look at it theologically. I think eschatologically, I think we could look at it from the perspective of this is the era we live in today is this present evil age, and the age to come is what's in the future. But when Jesus says things like this, the kingdom of God is in your midst, you could translate that in Luke, the kingdom of God's within you. Well, then to me, that age to come, that new age, has been established already. We're already in it. And so when I read the Sermon on the Mount, that's not some prophetic word about life in the kingdom one day that's unattainable to us. That's actually a description of life in the kingdom right now, which gives evidence of the new age, the age to come actually being present on this earth already. And so that's why I'm a big believer in all that. And I think that does tie into my eschatology. I'll be honest with y'all, I waver between being a historic premillennialist or an amillennialist, because I don't believe in the rapture of the church to be taken out and then 7 years of tribulation.
Which one day we'll have to probably do an entire podcast about that now.
We can, but I don't believe that. I used to believe that when I was younger. I don't believe that anymore. And you have passages in the scripture where people say, "Well, Jesus said, that day, people be working in the field, want to be like in the days of Noah, want to be taken, want to be left." And so they say, "Yeah, we're going to be taken out." Well, here's the problem with that: in the days of Noah, the ones that were taken were the wicked. Think about it. That's who got taken in the days of Noah, not the righteous.
Think about it.
The only ones that were left would have been Noah's family. Everybody else was taken away. So if you want to use the analogy of who's being taken away. Well, that to me sounds like judgment. That's what happened in the days of Noah.
Yeah. That sounds like a new earth.
It was a judgment. That's my point. So another reason I like in our great eschatology is it points us to life after death. It points us to this idea.
Okay, that's the phrase you are going to have to unpack.
That was my second question. Slow it down. Explain it like I'm 5.
That's my wife's catchphrase, by the way. Tell me like I'm 5.
And who does she teach every day?
5-year-old.
Yeah. But if earth and heaven collapse into that ultimate reality, which in some ways, if you think about it.
Yeah, which, by the way, this is the vision of Revelation 21.
Exactly.
We're coming back to life after death.
Earth get unified.
Together. Exactly. Which if
it's
you
a
think
wedding.
About it, is how it almost started in the Garden of Eden, where here's God's will and glory on display, and then you have this long story of brokenness.
Right.
And now God's going to redeem it all.
You've got to read Revelation and Genesis 1-3 hand in hand.
Correct. They fit together, and there's so much symbolism in it all. That's another reason the whole millennium thing makes me a little bit nervous, because when you're reading Revelation, you can't read Revelation like Luke wrote it. There's a reason that God didn't give Revelation to Luke. Luke is a historian. Luke is think about how Luke would write. It was
and how would you describe John?
Whatever year of Tiberius, everything he does.
Just the fact that he'd have like a fever dream and write it all down. That's just not very Luke.
Right.
You know what I mean?
So,
John is a painter, or probably
that's what I was going to say.
John probably would have run the theater department at UTA.
Yeah,
like
artist,
Yeah.
And all John says in Revelation, if you think about it, he'll say, "And then I saw." And then I saw. Okay, so is that always chronological? It's almost like John's in this, I almost feel like it's like an art gallery, and you walk in and it's like, oh my goodness, well, then I saw that, well, then I saw that.
And some of the art, with respect, is maybe like a political cartoon that we can't interpret.
Exactly.
Does that make sense? Like we've lost the lens through which that piece of art would have even made sense to us.
Exactly. Just like in my lifetime, things that were, that would communicate in one generation no longer communicate in this generation.
We've lost the key.
Right. Like when I first started preaching, I could say, Will Rogers said one time that Baptists loved to meet, they hate taxes, but they wear the roads out going to all their meetings, so we have to raise taxes to build more roads just so they can meet. Okay? Kind of funny.
Yeah.
The room when I first started preaching, I could say that. Now I say that, and the entire room goes, "Who was Will Rogers?
Yeah. What's going on?
I never heard of Will Rogers."
Yeah. That does not land.
So the point is, in my brief lifetime, things that used to connect to people just no longer connect. So just imagine some of the stuff John wrote that everybody would have understood in his day. Yeah. We have no clue.
We don't have we haven't found a letter that gives us the story of that we just don't know.
Exactly. So you're reading,
which is uncomfortable for some people, but
right.
We really don't understand.
Right. So what you got to be careful, in my opinion, is you can't pick and choose some of it and act like Luke wrote it, and then choose other parts of it and act like John wrote it. Because that's dicey to me. Well, that's symbolic, obviously. Well, no, that's literal. Okay. Well, help me understand how. Where's the little? Is there like a thing that like a?
Did you get a decoder out of the bottom of the cereal box?
There is no decoder.
That's not how it works. So that's why when I hold the whole conversation about the millennium a little bit more loosely, I'd rather talk more about.
Well, that's why we can say all three views are
absolutely
orthodox views.
And I've never been post-millennial. But I do vacillate sometimes between amillennial and historic pre. I'll be honest enough to say that. My brother Emerson and I, we talk about it all the time. He's straight up amillennial, has been for years. But regardless, having this idea that God is outfitting us right now for life after death. That to me is what's happening right now. When I've been redeemed, there's life after death.
Ultimate life.
We've got life after death.
Yeah, when you die.
So what's life after death?
Is there life after death? Yes.
Yes.
Christians
What is
around
it?
the world believe that.
But life after death is our ultimate eternal
So there's
destination.
life after death.
So can I back up? What's
Yeah.
life after death?
To be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord.
Okay.
Present-
Today you'll
fully
be with me in
present-
paradise.
fully present with
the
Lord Jesus
Absolutely.
Christ.
But you're not in your final state.
You're in not the fourth dimension,
No,
but another dimension.
Exactly. You're not there yet because the new earth hasn't been created yet. The new earth hasn't appeared yet. So you're
life
not
after
actually
that
living. That's right. That's where we're going to actually live.
Is the
for
new
eternity.
heaven
It's
and the
life
new
after
earth.
life
It's
after.
actually
You got
this
it.
world that I'm feeling and touching right now as God intended it.
Yeah,
and we get to
that's
be
right.
a part
It's
of it.
Eden.
That's right.
And I
Tree of
think-
life reappears.
And I think that's amazing.
Yes.
And we get to participate in
Yes.
some of that now.
Yes.
And that
Yes.
to me, that's the gospel. I mean, you're
Right.
the community engagement guy, but that's the gospel we hold up to people.
Yeah.
It's like
Yes.
you actually can be fully redeemed.
Yes, you can
Now-
have
And
an
participate in it
incredible life,
right now.
purposeful, meaningful.
But you have to live as God intended.
You got it.
Because that's what we're working toward.
already training for
That's
it.
what we're working toward in the end. And
that's what
and
you're
we're
training
partnering with
for.
God to make that come.
Yes. So Jesus, in his death, burial, and resurrection, and your embracing of that, that has secured your life after death. But now what you're doing is you're getting ready for the life after death. That's what's happening
And we're
right
actually
now
just
in your journey.
participating in this community
That's
of
what's
God.
going
Which
on
is
in your
when
life.
Revelation 21 happens. Heaven comes
You got
down,
it.
marries
That's
earth.
Right. That's right. And so to me, that's why passages like 1 Corinthians 2 are so complex. Because that's the
Let's
vision
talk about
God's
it.
already given to Paul, that there's something going on here. There's something afoot here that you're never going to come up with on your own. You're not going to be able to conjure this up no matter how smart you think you are.
Is this what you mean by it's foolishness apart from the Spirit?
Absolutely. It just
It's
is.
not that it won't ever make sense to you. It's
right.
you could have never come up with this.
Right. Exactly. So God's got something planned for us that's so much grander than we'd ever come up on our own. So like when you're reading David Garland's commentary on 1 Corinthians,
Which
is
David Garland?
Which is
My David
y'all's
Garland?
David Garland.
Okay.
I love Dave.
When
Not
you-
going to say
when
the
you-
best because I didn't know the other one, but pretty good David Garland.
Well, the other David Garland's an Old Testament guy.
Yeah.
So
Okay,
he's
that
New
helps.
Testament.
Yeah.
But he wrote a commentary back in the early 2000s on 1 Corinthians, and he talks about how just this ability to discern things from a physical human point of view is incredibly beautiful and a wonderful gift from God. It's just insufficient. The fact that you can see things, you can hear things, you can communicate things, you can imagine things, all those are great gifts from God. And we're grateful to the Lord for all of that. But if you truly want to understand this new heaven and new earth, what God's really up to, that something else has got to happen to you because your eyes, your ears, your mind, you're just never going to discern that from a human point of view. You've got to have this dynamic that's introduced to you by the Spirit of God that we receive whenever we're redeemed and restored into right relationship with God. And then all of a sudden something just comes alive in us that's just incredibly hard to explain. And what it is to me is this the work of God in my life that is preparing me for what eternity is really going to be like. Not just what happens when I die, but what's going to happen after Christ returns and everything gets restored. That's the life after death. And to me, that's what we draw people to. Because on the one hand, of course, when we say, well, we want people to go to heaven when they die. Yes, we do, but we want people to live. That's what it's all about. We want them to really live the way God intended them to live. That's going to happen after the ultimate consummation of the kingdom of God. And so what is the Spirit of God doing right now? He's revealing those kinds of things to us because the Spirit of God actually explores the depths of who God is in his own character. And to me, that's consistent with the Old Testament. Because as I talked about Sunday morning, this whole idea of the Jewish view of ethics it's not like, Aristotle, I want to give Aristotle credit. I might have sold him a little bit short Sunday. I didn't mean to. I just did it because
He's only one of the most important philosophers of all time.
who's ever lived. I mean, I'm a little
you
bit
were trying to run through some. Yeah, you were doing
because Plato and Aristotle, they viewed the world very differently. Plato sees human beings. He sees everything as somewhat of there's an ultimate constant, kind of an ultimate state of being, if you will, that just is what it is, and it's the ultimate reality. Whereas Aristotle would say, well, no, actually, you're in this constant state of becoming. There's this, there's the things you can do that actually affect who you are. Whereas Plato would have argued that's not really true. You just kind of are. This is just who you are because it's rooted in something much, much farther beyond anything we could ever know. So I'm Aristotelian in the sense that Aristotle at least said you can change. You can actually go and do these things right here every day.
Right.
And if you do them every day, you're going to be a better person.
Virtue is something you can develop.
You can do it. And
by practicing.
And not only that, it'll help all of us.
Yeah.
If every one of us would do it, Aristotle would argue, you're not just becoming, we're all becoming. Well, I've got enough Aristotelian realism in me that I think that's consistent with what I believe.
Appealing.
But the problem is Aristotle never dealt with that inner transformation that's got to really take place to make those virtues a true expression of who you are.
He just thought it was like learning to play piano.
Exactly. Gymnastics or whatever it may, or running a marathon.
Yeah.
Okay, you ran a marathon. You've run several.
You put in the work, you do it, you'll be a virtuous person.
That's great.
You're talking about transformed inner character.
Yes. Whereas
Use that phrase
the
in the sermon.
gospel is going to change everything in you. You know, when Jesus said, it's not what you ingest that makes you corrupt. It's what flows out of you. That's what really is corrupting to you. You can try to overcome it with virtue, but you can't ever really change it. The change has got to happen first on the inside, and that's what the gospel brings to us. And it has an eschatological feel to it. That's why I wanted to point out that the Jews always had that. They were looking towards shalom, that God's going to do something in the future.
Yeah, Joel was their prophet.
Yes, that's exactly right. He talked about the last days. So, they're aiming towards something, but you have to have that messianic interruption, if you will, that fulfillment to make it truly possible for all of us to experience the kingdom to its fullest. And so to me, that's where Christianity distinguishes itself among any other religion in the world. That God actually is offering something to us that redeems the very nature of who we are, and our character then can actually be transformed, and then a virtuous life is reflective of it, and then they feed off each other.
Right.
And it requires the Spirit of God. When Paul says, well, if you're a natural person, you're just not going to understand this. He's not saying that pejoratively. He's saying that pragmatically. He's saying that in a way to encourage you. Look, just because you use all this human wisdom, just realize it's always going to be limited. He said, let me give you an example. These Romans are some of the smartest people in the world, and they killed Jesus. Who's going to argue whether the Romans were smart or not, whether the Romans were wise or not? Well,
the
of course
Greeks
they
might.
were. Yeah, but you know what I mean? That whole world, that milieu, look what it's done. And they killed Jesus.
Yeah.
So you missed out on the most significant moment. Pontius Pilate.
They crucified the Lord of glory.
Yeah, you think about it. Pontius Pilate. You missed out on the single biggest moment of your entire life, not because you weren't wise, not because you didn't have savvy. This guy was politically savvy. He'd have never had the job he had. Now, granted, he was working in I don't know, pick some remote place in the U.S. He wasn't working in Washington D.C. Yeah. Okay, I get it.
Odessa.
But at least he was in charge where he was. You know what I mean? He was the man. And as smart as you had to be to get there, and as much political influence as you had to have that position, and who knows what your background and training may have been in Greek philosophy, which a lot of those people were trained in philosophy, guess what? You still fell short. And I think that's what Paul is saying. You can have all of this and you still don't get it. And it's not necessarily an indictment on you. It's an indictment on this world and how broken it is, and you've been born into it. So you've got to be reborn into another world so that you can actually see what's really going on. And, Augustine is the one who said, I don't understand everything so that I can believe. I believe so that I can understand. And to me, that's what faith is all about. And so, there's so much in this text. There's so much in what I tried to share Sunday morning. I'm going to try to build on it over these next few weeks because virtuous living is certainly important, but it's got to be connected to the inner transformation of our character.
Yeah.
For it to be real.
And you've referenced this book before, and I'll make this point, and then we probably need to wrap up. If you want to understand why just virtuous living by Aristotle doesn't, lead to transformation, you've referenced the book "The Air We Breathe" by Glenn Scrivener. Mm-hmm. He talks about how, ultimately Aristotle still upheld slavery.
Exactly.
Thought women were just objects.
I was about to say women. Look at his views on
women, slaves, everything. I mean,
yeah, great for his time, but
That's
no
right.
Jesus.
But he put limitations on it. In other words, you were born a slave. Well, then, you're a slave.
Be a virtuous slave, but you're a slave.
But you're never going to recover. If you're born a woman, I'm sorry.
There's no hope.
It's just, there's really nothing you can do about it, and you're only going to ever achieve a certain level because you're a woman. I mean, that is Aristotle for sure. And so as much as he believed in change, he never had a really holistic view of what God made possible for people, even before Christ, whereas that's where the Jews distinguished themselves. Aristotle talked about telos, this kind of ultimate end, where the Greek, the church And the Jews are going to talk about teleos, God's desired end. What's God working
And
toward.
this is the law written on human hearts, not tablets of stone.
Exactly. And so that's why eschatology is infused into everything that we live today. It's inaugurated already because it all connects. So I could talk about it.
I would say that this is a great invitation to come back next week.
Let's do it again.
Yeah. Okay. This is but the intro. But the intro.
Because this coming Sunday, we're going to talk about...
not tell me more.
We're going to
Obviously,
talk about
I'm
all
going
of
to
it.
come back to tell me more.
But this coming Sunday, we're going to talk about how the mind has got to be transformed, that seat of our ability to understand and truly embrace all of this, that's got to somehow be transformed. And so Paul says in Romans 12, this is what's going to happen to you. This is how you're now going to live because your mind is going to be completely changed and renewed. And when that happens, well, that just changes everything. So, and it allows you to live more fully into what God really has planned for us. So looking forward to that.
To
Good word.
be continued.
Yes.
Okay, thanks for listening, everyone.
Thanks for listening to the Tell Me More podcast today. You can subscribe to this podcast on your app of choice, or you can visit us at fbca.org to find out more information about the podcast and our church. Thanks for listening. Have a good day.